In 1910, on a peaceful hilltop in Louisville, Kentucky, a hospital opened with one simple mission: cure tuberculosis, save lives. 51 years later, roughly 6,000 people had died inside its walls, and the building had developed an entire hidden system for moving the dead, one that the living were never supposed to know about. Today, Waverly Hills Sanatorium is famous. Millions of people know it as one of the most haunted buildings in America. Television crews have walked its hallways with cameras and recording equipment, searching for ghosts. Tourists pay to spend the night inside. The internet is full of stories about shadow figures, disembodied voices, and a room on the 5th floor where nurses supposedly took their own lives. But underneath all of that is a real story. And it is worse than any ghost tale. It is a story about a disease that no one could stop, a building that was never big enough, and a tunnel that carried thousands of bodies into the earth while the patients above kept waiting for a cure that would not arrive for decades. Before the hospital, the hilltop belonged to a man named Major Thomas Hayes. He bought the land in 1883 as a family home. Because the property sat so far from any school, Hayes built a one-room schoolhouse and hired a teacher named Lizzie Lee Harris. Harris loved the novels of Sir Walter Scott, so she named the little school Waverly. Hayes liked the name and started calling the whole property Waverly Hill. At some point, the second E was dropped. Nobody is quite sure when. It did not matter. The name stuck. By the early 1900s, Louisville had a serious problem. Tuberculosis was killing people at one of the highest rates of any city in the country. Nearly 20% of all deaths in the region were caused by this single disease. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that attacks the lungs. It spreads through the air, through tiny droplets released when an infected person coughs or even breathes. In a crowded room, a single carrier could infect dozens of people without anyone realizing it. If that sounds familiar, it should. The world learned in recent years just how devastating an airborne illness can become when it moves faster than medicine can respond. But this crisis did not last for months. It lasted for decades, with no vaccine, no treatment, and almost no understanding of how the disease actually worked. Louisville was especially vulnerable. The city sits in the Ohio River Valley, surrounded by low wetlands that trapped stagnant, humid air. Industrial pollution hung over the neighborhoods. Overcrowded housing meant families lived pressed together in conditions where the disease could tear through an entire block. In 1906, local health officials formed the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital and began searching for a place to build a facility that could isolate and treat the infected. They chose Hayes's old hilltop property. The elevation offered better airflow. The distance from the city provided natural quarantine, and the peaceful setting, they believed, would help patients recover. That belief turned out to be mostly wrong, but the hill was beautiful and the name sounded calm, so the board kept it. Construction began in 1908. The original hospital was a modest two-story wooden building with 2 open-air pavilions designed to hold between 40 and 50 patients. It was full almost immediately. By 1912, the tuberculosis crisis had overwhelmed the hospital. Louisville's main city hospital announced that its new facility would not accept tuberculosis patients at all. Every single tuberculosis case in the city system was transferred to Waverly Hills. Patients arrived faster than beds could be built. Some lived in tents on the grounds, waiting for space inside a building that already could not hold the people it had. In those early years, roughly 1 in 3 patients admitted to Waverly Hills died there. A children's pavilion was added in 1914. It housed sick children who needed treatment, but it also housed something far more heartbreaking: healthy children. Kids who had nothing wrong with them, but whose parents were inside the sanatorium, too sick to care for them and too contagious to let them go home. Think about what that means. Tuberculosis spread through the air, and these children were living on the grounds of a tuberculosis hospital, breathing the same air, simply because there was nowhere else for them to be. By the early 1920s, the wooden buildings were falling apart. The patient count had surged past 140, and the need for a real facility had become undeniable. In March of 1924, Construction began on a new building, $1.1 million, roughly $20 million in today's money, 5 stories, designed by the Louisville architect D.X. Murphy in a Tudor Gothic style that still stands today. On October 17, 1926, the new Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened. It was, by the standards of its time, extraordinary. 180,000 square feet, room for more than 400 patients. Every patient had access to a telephone and a radio. A local radio station operator installed headphone jacks between the solarium doors so patients could plug in and listen to their favorite programs from their beds on the open-air porches. The facility was almost entirely self-contained. It had its own farm, its own bakery, its own water treatment plant and power station, its own post office, and its own zip code. Doctors, nurses, and their families all lived on the property. Because tuberculosis was so contagious, once you entered Waverly Hills, you did not leave. Not the patients, not the staff. Everyone on that hilltop became a permanent resident. If you have been to Waverly Hills, or if this is your first time hearing any of this, I would like to know what stands out to you. Drop a comment and tell me whether the real history or the ghost stories brought you here. There is something the new building's history does not advertise. The 1926 facility served white patients only. Black patients continued to be treated in the old, deteriorating wooden structure with fewer resources and worse conditions. It was not until the 1940s that the segregated facilities were improved. For all of its modern conveniences, the new building still faced the same fundamental problem. There was no cure for tuberculosis. The best the staff could do was manage symptoms and try to keep people alive. The primary treatment was fresh air and sunlight. Patients were wheeled onto open porches in their beds, sometimes for hours at a time, even in winter. Photographs from the era show patients lying outside under blankets of snow, breathing cold Kentucky air, because the doctors believed it was better than the air inside. On the 5th floor rooftop, children with tuberculosis of the bone received a treatment called heliotherapy, extended exposure to direct sunlight. There was a swing set up there so the children could play while they absorbed the ultraviolet rays that doctors hoped would kill the bacteria. Children on a rooftop playground, 5 stories above a building full of the dying. It is one of the strangest images from Waverly's history. When fresh air and sunlight failed, the treatments turned desperate. Doctors performed a procedure called artificial pneumothorax, in which air was injected into the chest cavity to partially or completely collapse an infected lung. The theory was that a collapsed lung could rest and heal. The results were often disastrous. And then there was thoracoplasty, a last resort. Doctors removed ribs from the patient's chest wall to give the remaining lung tissue room to expand. The average patient lost 7 or 8 ribs. Most of them did not survive it. Nearly half of the patients who arrived at Waverly were already in the final stage of tuberculosis when they walked through the doors. They were not coming to be cured. They were coming because there was nowhere else to go. And for many of them, Waverly Hills was the last building they would ever see. Death at Waverly was not an event. It was a rhythm. During the worst years, patients died almost daily. According to Dr. J. Frank Stewart, a former assistant medical director at the hospital, the single deadliest year saw 152 deaths. Each body presented the same problem. If surviving patients watched a steady stream of the dead being carried out the front door, whatever willpower they had left to fight would collapse. Morale, the doctors believed, was just as important as medicine. The staff needed a way to move the dead without the living ever knowing. The answer was already built into the hill. Running from the first floor of the main building to the railroad tracks at the bottom of the hill was a tunnel, 525 feet long, angled at roughly 45 degrees into the earth. It had been built originally as a supply route, a way to haul coal and food up the steep hillside. But as the death toll climbed, the tunnel found a second purpose. A rail and cable system was installed. Bodies were placed onto the cart and lowered through the tunnel, out of the building, out of sight, to waiting hearses at the bottom of the hill. The patients above never saw the dead leave. That was the point. Over time, this passage became known as the body chute. In January of 1937, something happened that would erase much of Waverly's history permanently. Heavy rains pounded the Ohio River Valley for nearly 2 weeks. The river crested at 30 feet above flood stage. Nearly 70% of Louisville was submerged. 175,000 people were forced from their homes. 90 people died in the city alone. It was the worst flood in Louisville's history. Waverly Hills sat on its hilltop above the floodwaters. But the institution's medical records did not. Documents dating back to the earliest years of the hospital were destroyed. The names, the diagnoses, the treatment histories of thousands of patients vanished in the muddy water. Later, after the hospital finally closed, the remaining records were carelessly discarded. The result is a void. We know approximately 6,000 people died at Waverly Hills based on surviving death certificates filed from 1911 onward. But the full story, the individual stories, most of those are gone. That void is the reason the myths exist. You may have seen the number 63,000 attached to Waverly Hills online. That figure is not real. It is an exaggeration that has been repeated so many times, it has taken on the weight of fact. The actual number is a fraction of that, likely between 6,000 and 8,000. But the correction does not make the story smaller. 6,000 people died in a single building over 50 years. That is roughly 2 deaths per week, every week, for half a century. Then something changed. In 1943, scientists isolated an antibiotic called streptomycin. For the first time, there was a drug that actually worked against tuberculosis. It took 6 more years for that drug to reach the patients at Waverly Hills, while production scaled and clinical trials moved through the system. 6 years in which people continued to die from a disease that now had a cure. By 1949, streptomycin was being administered at Waverly. Combined with another drug developed in 1952, tuberculosis became a manageable infection. The patient population dropped steadily through the 50s. 373 patients in 1950, down to 293 by 1960. In June 1961, Waverly Hills closed. The remaining patients were transferred to Hazelwood Sanatorium in Louisville. For the first and only time in a story like this, the institution closed because science won. But the building was not done. In 1962, the former sanatorium reopened as Woodhaven Geriatric Center, a nursing home for elderly patients with dementia, limited mobility, and severe disabilities. Almost immediately, Woodhaven developed serious problems. The facility was chronically understaffed and overcrowded. Reports surfaced of patient neglect, squalid conditions, and questionable treatment practices. The same hallways where tuberculosis patients had once fought for every breath now housed a different kind of suffering. The quiet, invisible kind that happens when a society puts its most vulnerable people in a building and looks away. The state of Kentucky shut Woodhaven down around 1980. Everything inside was auctioned off. The doors were locked. What followed was one of the strangest stretches in the history of any American institution. A developer bought the property and proposed turning it into a minimum security prison. Neighbors protested, and the plan was dropped. An apartment conversion was proposed, but financing fell through. In 1996, a non-profit purchased the building with plans to construct what would have been the world's tallest statue of Jesus Christ, a 150-foot replica of Rio de Janeiro's Christ the Redeemer, perched on the roof of the former sanatorium. That project also collapsed for lack of funding. Meanwhile, the building decayed. Vandals smashed windows. Teenagers broke in looking for thrills. Homeless people sheltered in the wards. The hallways filled with graffiti and debris. and as the building emptied of the living, the stories about the dead began to grow. There is a room on the 5th floor that became the center of Waverly's most persistent legend. Room 502. The story, as it is commonly told, goes like this. In 1928, a young nurse was found dead in the room. She had taken her own life, supposedly because she was pregnant and unmarried. Then, in 1932, another nurse fell from the rooftop patio near the same room, several stories to the ground below. The story has been repeated in documentaries, television shows, and countless articles. But when you look closely, the evidence dissolves. There are no documented records confirming either death. The light fixture in room 502 hangs from a decorative chain too light to support the weight of a person. There are no rafters in the room. The pipe near the door was part of a sprinkler system that was not installed until 1972, more than 4 decades after the supposed event. A former employee who reportedly corroborated the story was born in 1922, which means he would have been 6 years old at the time of the alleged first death. Something may have happened in or near that room to plant the seed of the legend, but the version most people know was built on embellishment, not evidence. When the records were destroyed, the stories took over. There is one patient whose story has been preserved, though not through official records. A young woman named Lois Higgs entered Waverly Hills in the mid-1950s for tuberculosis treatment. She was in her late 20s. According to accounts shared by tour guides and later corroborated by members of her own family, Higgs improved enough to leave the hospital briefly. During that time away, she became pregnant. She carried the baby to term inside the sanatorium. After the birth, the child was taken from her. Her family would visit, and Higgs could see her baby from the balcony, but she could not hold it. Her health declined, and she died at Waverly Hills in 1956 at the age of 28. Today, visitors leave flowers and small gifts in the room where she stayed. Her story has become part of the building's living memory, passed from guide to visitor year after year. In 2001, Charlie and Tina Mattingly purchased the property for roughly $230,000. They began restoring the building using revenue from historical tours, paranormal tours, and an annual haunted house. They installed new windows, doors, and a roof. Waverly Hills now draws thousands of visitors each year from around the world. The building is still here. The people who died inside it, for the most part, are not remembered by name. Some are listed on death certificates filed with the state. Most are not. The flood took their records. Time took the rest. What remains is a 180,000 square foot building on a hilltop in Louisville, named after a series of novels that a school teacher loved. A tunnel that descends 525 feet into the earth, and roughly 6,000 stories that no one will ever fully be able to tell. If you think places like Waverly Hills deserve to have their real history told, not just their ghost stories, let me know in the comments. And if there is another institution you want me to cover, I want to hear about it.